Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started, so if people want to take their chairs. So my name's Christine Olaris. I'm the CEO at Fitzroy Legal Service, and it's my pleasure to be your MC for this evening. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting tonight at the wonderful Wheeler Centre on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and also to any First Nations people who are here tonight. Tonight we will be discussing women's incarceration, and within that context I think it's also important that we recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are 21 times more likely to end up in prison than other women. We recognise the ongoing impacts of colonisation for First Nations peoples and the structural racism that continues to exist in our society and indeed in our justice system. I would like to warmly welcome you all to this event, both those of you who have come out in person. I don't think it's raining yet, but there was certainly the risk, and also those of you who are joining via the online stream at home. We're thrilled to have so many people interested in hearing about women's lived experience in decarceration and carceral resistance. And we're thrilled for a couple of reasons. So first off, for us it's a really important priority. It's an important part of our advocacy and our research at Fitzroy Legal Service, and I'm sure for many of you here as well. Secondly, because the evening aims to centre women's lived experience of criminalisation, which is also a key component of our approach to community-driven justice. If you're interested, we do have two very pertinent pieces of research that sit on our website at fls.org.au. One is called Constellation of Circumstances, which looked at the burgeoning number of women in remand in Victoria, and that was, we partnered with La Trobe University and Deakin University in that piece of research. And the other is called Gendered Injustice, and it has a specific focus on policing and also on the criminalisation of victim survivors of family violence. So do check those out if you're interested in these topics. And I presume you are, because you're here tonight. For those of you here at the Wheeler Centre, just a little bit of orientation of the room. Hopefully you saw as you came in either side, out through the doors, there are the toilets. So there's an all-gender toilet, a male and a female toilet. So if you need to, of course, get up and go. And also, if you're finding the subject matter a bit much and you want to just go out and have 5 minutes break, feel free to do that as well. And should there be an emergency, the wonderful staff of the Wheeler Centre will come out and help us. So that's good to know. But the exit is pretty much out the way you came in, so you'd be heading that direction. We planned for the event tonight to finish up sometime between 8 and 8:30, and we're going to just see how it goes. I think we got you all to put 8:30 in your calendars, but we might finish a little bit earlier. There will be a break in the middle, and at that point in time, for those of you here in the room, there will be some delicious snacks, which are there, but ready to go, from the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, and who provided the catering for this evening. And I guess for those of you at home, you might just want to zip into the kitchen and get yourself a refreshment of some sort. And also for those online, we will let you know at that point in time what time we'll be coming back, because we really do want you to come back. Oops. For those of you who are inclined, we would love you to be sharing anything about tonight's event on social media. We've got a couple of hashtags. So one is community-driven justice. The other one is keep women out of prison. And I just always like to remind people, if you can capitalise the letters, it makes it much more accessible. So please do that. Capitalise the first letter of each of those words. And if you tag us in at Fitzroy Legal, we'll reshare your post. So that's community-driven justice, keep women out of prison. So thank you. So we've got two panels this evening. So the first one you will hear from sector practitioners who will discuss the systemic changes that are required to address the overrepresentation and over-incarceration of women. I would at this point like to just acknowledge the incredible commitment and investment of the Victorian Legal Services Board, who have for a number of years now supported a number of projects that seek to address women's incarceration and criminalisation. And a couple of those are Living Free and Women Transforming Justice will be topics that the panellists will speak to tonight. The second panel will be after the break, and it will comprise women with lived experience of incarceration, and they're going to discuss their experiences. They will provide expertise on issues and challenges, and they'll also tell us what they think the way forward is. We want to have a focus on solutions tonight. I think that's really important that we start thinking about how do we improve the situation, and so I encourage you to think about that as you're listening this evening. You will have an opportunity after that second panel to ask questions of our lived experience experts, and for those of you here at the Wheeler Centre in person. I don't think we've got Uncle Ringo here, have we? No. So we're supposed to have Uncle Ringo Terrick coming. We haven't heard from him, so he may still be on his way, and if he does, we will pause to let him do his welcome to country. Yeah, Uncle Ringo is someone who's got a long history of working with Fitzroy Legal Service around issues including homelessness, and worked with us on the Bendigo Street proceedings where we advocated on behalf of people who were occupying vacant houses, and he's been engaged with us since then and is now a kind of neighbour at the Black Pearl, which is a creative community, creative studio and gathering place for Aboriginal people in Yarra, and it's located right next to us, so we're really looking forward to building that relationship. So if he does turn up, he's had his intro, and we will get him up, but we'll keep an eye on that. All right, so we'll jump into the content of the evening. So right now, there are 362 women who are in Victoria's prisons. 204 of those are unsentenced. That's 56%. The percentage of unsentenced Aboriginal women in our prisons is higher still. In fact, it's estimated at about 89%. The rate at which women are being imprisoned in Victoria has sharply risen over recent years. Women tend to be locked up for less serious, non-violent offences. Fitzroy Legal Services Gendered Injustice Research Report found that the most common issues women who were criminalised experienced were domestic and family violence, poverty, homelessness and housing insecurity, trauma, mental illness and/or psychological distress, and alcohol and other drug dependencies, and often a combination of those things. So there's a critical need to address women's over-incarceration, to learn from successful projects within the sector and listen to the expertise of women with first-hand experience of criminalisation and incarceration. We need to understand what's needed to keep women out of the criminal justice system. So we'll get started. I'm going to introduce first up Elena Campbell. Elena will be the moderator for the first panel. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Elena, and then I'll get you a little bit, and then I'll get you up onto the stage. So Elena is the Associate Director of Research, Advocacy and Policy at the Centre for Innovative Justice at RMIT University. She's a lawyer, writer, and a former political staffer who has worked in the legal and policy sector for over 2 decades. She's also been as a consultant on a range of social policy and justice organisations, including for the Australian Human Rights Commission. At the Centre for Innovative Justice, Elena oversees a program of research which predominantly focuses on family violence, court interventions, crime victimisation, and importantly, the way in which experiences of trauma, including structural and systemic trauma, can push vulnerable cohorts like women into contact with the criminal justice system. So I'll get Elena to come up now. Elena's got a bit of a croaky voice tonight, so she's also asked me now to introduce the panel members. I'm going to do a kind of shortened version of your intros, I think, because my voice is also going to go if I'm not careful. So first off, we've got Ali Pappas. Ali's the founder and Chief Executive Officer of the Law and Advocacy Centre for Women, and a community legal centre established specifically to combat women's increasing criminalisation and imprisonment. And she also sits on the board as an executive director. Ali is a passionate advocate and leader who is dedicated to working collaboratively with organisations and individuals to address the causes of women's criminalisation. She holds a Master's in Public and International Law from the University of Melbourne, and she's worked as a volunteer with the Mental Health Legal Centre, the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, and the Fitzroy Legal Service as well. There you go. Welcome, Ali. I've also got Lisa Abbott. Who is the Executive Director, Social Impact and Growth at Taskforce Community Agency, a not-for-profit operating in Victoria, delivering a suite of services to our most marginalised. Lisa has worked with those in contact with the justice system for 20 years in government and community, and over the last 5 years has been living the development and delivery of the Living Free project, a project supporting vulnerable girls and women who are at risk of or have early contact with the justice system. So this project drives cross-sectoral collaboration and seeks to improve surface system responses to enhance our health and community sector support to women who often fall through the service gaps. Sorry, I am really just going to have a little drink of water. There's two more. Karen Fletcher from Flat Out. Karen Fletcher is the Executive Officer of Flat Out Inc., a community organisation that supports and advocates for women and trans and gender diverse people to get out and stay out of prison. She's a lawyer by trade. She's worked as a prison advocacy lawyer at Fitzroy Legal Service and Prisoners Legal Service Queensland as a public health lawyer with a special interest in drug decriminalisation in government and non-government agencies. She's an activist in the Homes Not Prisons campaign in Victoria. And finally, Megan Pearce. So Megan has spent much of her career working alongside criminalised people, particularly women and children. Having started her career as a criminal defence lawyer at Legal Aid Queensland, Megan also led major law reform inquiries into Victoria's criminal trial processes and child protection systems. Between 2018 and 2022, Megan worked at Darebin Community Legal Centre, which merged with Fitzroy Legal Service in 2019. First managing the Women's Transforming Justice project and then Fitzroy Legal Service's Social Action and Public Interest Law team. In both these roles, Megan contributed to program design and advocacy work aimed at disrupting the cycle of women's criminalisation. And in July 2022, Megan commenced a role at the Victorian Legal Aid, focusing on discrimination and equality law. I'm going to ask all the panellists to come up, and I'm going to hand it over to Alana. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, that's excellent. You know how sometimes I was relying on the microphone sort of being really obvious and there being a big green button or a big red button? There wasn't. There was a tiny silver button. So I was slightly concerned for a minute. Thank you, everyone. Welcome. It's great to have everyone come out tonight as well as join us online, and it's a very, very strange sensation to be doing this in person. I haven't been participating or hosting a panel discussion in person since just pre-pandemic, so if I sort of start to space out or look slightly disoriented, that's why. I, of course, want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which we're joining today, and obviously all the lands from which people are joining online. These are stolen lands, but one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight is really about the impacts of stolen lives and stolen futures because of the impacts of the criminal justice system. And at this point, I just want to acknowledge that Auntie Vicky Roach was going to be a panellist with us tonight, but unfortunately is unwell and was very disappointed not to be able to join us. So we're very aware of that. We're going to be sensitive to try and represent or at least reflect on those considerable impacts on Aboriginal communities throughout the discussion tonight. Okay, so we'll get down to business. It's going to be a little bit fluid and loosey-goosey. We all know each other. We might be a bit informal, so just forgive us for that. Everyone's been working in this area for a long time. We're all very passionate about decarceration and really getting women out of prison and helping them to stay out. For those of you who don't know much about the CIJ, we're an independent research and reform organisation attached to RMIT, but we all come from policy and practice backgrounds, so we sort of want to get down and into the implementation of solutions. And so part of our remit for existing essentially is to provide an evidence base for reform in the justice system, because many of you will readily recognise that the justice system is one of the least evidence-based areas of policy that you could possibly find. So we are about sort of developing a greater, more solid evidence base in particular areas. And one of those areas is women's contact with the criminal justice system. And I was very privileged to work with some of this lot on evaluating the Women Transforming Justice program a little while ago, which was a sensational multi-component program which provided gender-informed legal and social work support to women to try and get them out of prison, have them receive bail successfully, but also succeed on bail, because we know that there are so many considerations and factors that go into that. Alongside that, though, there was this amazing project that still is operating, supporting and developing the advocacy skills of women with lived experience. And we're going to hear from those women tonight after the break, so I'm not going to steal any of their thunder. I am just going to talk about some of the kind of systemic components that we saw in that evaluation first. And that was just simply the fact that the needs of women in contact with the criminal justice system are so kind of completely failed by the existing service system that it was very, very evident how women in contact with the criminal justice system will often fall through the gaps. So they're labelled as too complex. The siloed way of systems operating means that if they can't fit in with this particular service response, they are also not going to fit in with another particular service response. And we did some court observations as part of our evaluation. And one of the things that really stood out to us was a reflection by a very well-meaning magistrate who said, in a bail application, well, but for Women Transforming Justice, I would be remanding you today. But I know that you have a support worker there who's going to walk alongside you. So that's the only reason that I feel that it's going to be safe to allow you to go back into the community. And that stood out for us because it sort of was a perhaps unintended concession that the correctional system is functioning as a proxy for a properly operating social service system. So that's what we want to talk about first today. I'm going to throw to Karen or Lisa. Karen, do you want to talk about one of the biggest factors that or areas in which we're failing women, and that is failure to deliver proper social housing?
Thanks. Well, yeah, I also wanted to acknowledge that we're here on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation and pay respects to elders past and present and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or other First Nations people here today. I want to acknowledge the resistance of First Nations people to the invasion and theft of their country and their homes, and I want to talk about homes, through their violent removal from country and home and family, and their incarceration in the first network of specialised prisons for dispossessed people, which was I think we need to look back on as the genesis of the kind of criminal injustice system that we're coping with today. I went down a rabbit hole this afternoon looking at the history of the incarceration of First Nations people in Victoria. I'm quite familiar with the sort of history in Queensland coming from the Prisoners Legal Service, and we have the infamous Palm Island, which was a prison island for First Nations people who resisted imprisonment in protection missions and stations in Queensland. Anybody who showed a bit of resistance was carted off to Palm Island. And, you know, it doesn't take much to find the same sort of pattern in Victoria, and the 6 missions and reserves that served in Victoria as places of incarceration of dispossessed peoples in this state who were removed from their homes and taken to those places. And today we still see the same: dispossession, separation of families, incarceration and the commission of violence against First Nations people, families, communities. I guess I just wanted to express the hope that we're going to be able to delve a little bit deeper into the mechanisms by which that is continuing to be perpetrated in Victoria at the moment. It's just really quite confronting looking at the detail of how those imprisonments worked in Victoria on the missions and in the reserves, the kinds of things that we still see in terms of the children being separated from the adults forcibly, the children being under particular kinds of discipline, the youth detention issues that we're seeing in Dondale, in Tasmania, in Western Australia and here in Victoria. Really, it just echoes through the history of how it started. So yes, I guess that's the first thing to say. Also, I guess I should say I'm in the Homes Not Prisons campaign, and our elder, our inspiration and our grounding for the campaign does come from our elder Vicky Roach, Auntie Vicky Roach, who these days lives up near Wollongong in pretty poor health but still in incredible fighting spirit. And she actually wrote a speech for a rally that we had outside the Parliament on Friday afternoon, and I've got it with me, so if it's appropriate I'll quote a little bit from her about housing. I might just actually start with what she says about housing as a way of sort of kicking things off. Yeah. I'm also a little bit nervous because I'm not usually nervous in these things, but after all these years of being locked down, it's just weird. Anyway, this is Auntie Vicky on housing. I should say, Auntie Vicky did quite a few years at the Dame Phyllis Frost Centre here in Victoria, and she also did short stints in a number of other prisons around Australia, including in New South Wales, but the biggest stint she did was here at DPFC. But she says, getting housing made a big difference for me. I got a job after I got housing. But you can't get started on anything. Your health, safety, well-being, nothing without a house, a home base. Without permanent, secure, affordable housing, Aboriginal women become so enmeshed in the criminal justice system because they're in and out on a regular basis for the rest of their lives. We're the revolving door women. We often serve relatively short sentences, but even so we lose everything we have on the outside. All our personal possessions, clothes, photos and other sentimental mementos, our accommodation and even our children. We have to start from scratch every time, over and over again, and with mind-numbing consistency. We have to maintain the fight to either keep or have our children returned to us. And Auntie Vicky was stolen from her mother was stolen from her mother, and Auntie Vicky lost her son through child removal as well. So these words are spoken from great experience. And I should also say, I think that Auntie Vicky was a peer support worker at the Dame Phyllis Frost Centre on a few occasions when Auntie Veronica Nelson, who died in custody a couple of years ago at DPFC and whose inquest is underway at the moment, was there, and she observed that Veronica was one of the women that she has called revolving door women, in and out of DPFC for short periods, for a very long time, and suffering from housing instability and all the other things that see people go in and out in a revolving door into prison. So yeah, I did have a couple of slides, but I'll say what they say, which is essentially, if you have a look at what's happening in Victoria, we've got an escalation of the kind of injustice that has been happening for women, and particularly Aboriginal women, for decades. But it's escalating in the last 5 to 10 years. And if you have a look at the graphs of the number of women that are going in on short sentences, so I'm talking about a week, sorry, not on sentences at all, for short periods, for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, it is going from negligible to off the scale. Just in the last few years, and others are going to talk about the reasons for that in terms of bail laws, but this problem of people not having any way of breaking that cycle by finding a safe place to live is a big part of that story. And even if we do improve bail, you know, people released on bail still won't have anywhere to go because we've got a housing crisis in this state. You can't find private rentals. At Flat Out, we're a service that supports women coming out of prison. I've had a worker at Flat Out literally apply for 200 private rentals for somebody trying to find somewhere to live, because there is absolutely no chance of public housing with 100,000 individuals on the waiting list and a waiting time of over 10 years. And the crunch in the private rental sector literally means there is no housing. This is, you know, you talked about evidence. Yes, the criminal legal system is just so not evidence-based, but it isn't as though there isn't any evidence. And I want to congratulate, I'm not a researcher, I'm not an academic, I don't know, you know, a lot about the academic exercise, but I want to thank people who do that, because they have produced mountains of evidence that what keeps people out of prison is housing. And the people who are coming out of prison, like Auntie Vicky and others, have been telling us for decades that the thing that will give them the best chance of staying out of prison is housing. And yet we're still asking, oh, I wonder what people with lived experience think. They've been telling us for decades. Academics have been telling us for decades. The thing that works is housing, and it needs to be housing first. We've got the exact opposite in Victoria, where public housing under the Residential Tenancies Act literally excludes people who are using drugs. That is a reason under the Act for the eviction of people from public housing. So the absolute opposite of a housing first approach, which is that you get housed first and then you can have the opportunity to deal with the trauma and the self-medication that goes with the trauma.
Thanks, Karen, because I think that's a beautiful segue into recognising that women in contact with the criminal justice system are there because they have particular needs and particular experiences, most of which stem completely from trauma. But we have a system that doesn't understand that or sees the manifestation, whether it's substance abuse, as the issue rather than the trauma, which was the cause in the first place, and doesn't have a gendered lens on that, understanding that particularly women are self-medicating, as you mentioned, or other things that are driving them into contact with the criminal justice system in that way. Lisa, do you want to have a sort of a reflection on, from your work, in particularly working with young women, about the need for gender-informed responses?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Karen. That was everything that you said. We have been working with young women, I guess, at the other end of the spectrum. So trying to divert young women from going into custody. So what we have found, which is no new evidence, it's around the multiple and complex needs, and that our service system, the way that programs are designed, the way that the policy, the way it's rolled out, is actually not supporting our most vulnerable women. And there is a mountain of evidence, as well as around the needs of women in the justice system, around gender responsive service provision. So a lot of our women also have dependent children. And so it's not only is a huge thing. We seem to forget Maslow's hierarchy, the housing needs. However, there's also multiple needs going on with their children as well: drug and alcohol, mental health, family violence, and a lot of civic resistance. They've often had child protection involvement in the past, whether as a child themselves or also with their own children. So that having a space if you look at drug and alcohol treatment, for instance, there's no gendered service provision. So if you have a woman that is wanting to address their drug and alcohol needs, however has dependent children, there's always that fear of those children being removed. The models of care also don't see us focusing on connection and meeting the women where they're at, and actually focusing on stability. And if you look at the evidence of responding to complex trauma, that is the absolute foundational phase: stability and connection. And our service system, the more complex a woman presents, the harder it is to get services. And so there is so much, there is such a need, I think, for all services to be honest about some of those barriers in providing that gender responsive service provision to women, whether that be in the family violence sector, mental health, we need to actually acknowledge that as services from those sectors around what some of those barriers are, and actually listen to the women, because we know it works, and that opportunities for cross-sectoral collaboration as well. You know, I often think you've got, you know, I said to Elena, I could sit up here with so many examples of where the system has actually failed. However, there is many examples of where coordinated and responsive service delivery can actually break that trajectory and actually stop that entrenchment in that cycle that you were talking about, Karen. So, you know, we need to think of the women, the young women, that we know that the evidence is there. We know what some of those risk factors are, and we need to build up those protective factors. And I think we can do it in the service system. It just takes a little bravery to do it a bit differently.
Fantastic, thanks Lisa. Of course, one of the biggest challenges, Megan gets some of the pointy end stuff here, is thinking about gender responsive responses when women of any age, whether they're young and at risk of coming into contact with the criminal justice system or are through that revolving door again and again, are coming into contact with police. So Megan, what are some of the biggest challenges that we're seeing still in 2022 on that front?
Excuse me, oh no, this is not a good start. Is this? Hello?
Yes.
Hello. I'm also a little bit nervous, and you know how they say when you're nervous about speaking in front of an audience you should picture everyone naked? I think I actually should just picture everyone behind my computer screen, and then I would be feeling a bit more relaxed. Anyway, it's been wonderful hearing from everyone, and I feel really proud to sit up alongside everyone today and to have worked with you all for the last many years in some cases, and really sad that we can't hear from Aunty Vicky, but grateful for you having passed on her words. So thanks, Aunty Vicky. You're absolutely right, Elaine, you can't talk about the causes of women's over-criminalisation and over-incarceration without talking about policing. And I'm hearing from people about, you know, what can be the consequences, the complexity of women's lives and all the responses that we don't have. But one response we do seem to consistently fall back on is cops, more and more of them. The relationship between policing and women's criminalisation is layered and complex, but it is there, it is undeniable, and it is forceful. We've heard a bit today about how women initially come into contact with the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system, and the drivers of that. And I think in many instances, police are the gatekeepers of that moment. They hold a huge amount of decision-making power. When police are called to an incident, the outcome of that attendance will often depend on the view that a police officer takes, and they can be the one who decides whether a woman becomes part of that revolving door, or a really visceral expression that I've heard used before is ends up in carceral churn, just this cycling in and out. And those decisions about whether a woman ends up in that cycle are also infected by racism and other prejudices. So a report that Elena has authored into Leaving Custody Behind, into the drivers of women's criminalisation and some of its solution, highlighted a really telling stat for me, which is that we know that Aboriginal women are more likely to be prosecuted for minor offences such as disorderly conduct, minor property offences and traffic offences and breaches of court orders. And there's a pretty stark statistic in that report, which is that a New South Wales study showed that over 80% of Aboriginal people were arrested and prosecuted for cannabis use, and just over 50% of non-Aboriginal people. And when we consider also that police are relied on as the first responders for a growing number of complex social problems, in particular family violence, mental health crises, drug dependence and homelessness, and we know that all of these social problems have distinctive gendered elements, perhaps, or arguably, family violence the most so. And we have a constantly growing police force in Victoria. So between, I think, 2015 and 16 and 2020 and 21, Victoria's police force grew more than any other state and territory in Australia. It grew by 6%, in funding it grew by 6% per person, and the amount of money that the Victorian government spends on policing nearly doubled in less than 10 years, from 2 billion in 2011-12 to nearly 4 billion in 2020 and 21. So we're certainly spending money on something. I guess I wanted to step out a little bit more explicitly what this increase in policing and this reliance on policing for the social problems that can afflict women's lives. And I wanted to talk through what that can look like in practical terms. And I thought family violence would be a good way to illustrate that. And so we know that police are the first port of call for family violence incidents in Victoria. And it makes up 20% of the police call-outs. Sorry, family violence incidents make up about 20% of police call-outs. And we know that police attendance at family violence incidents often results in the criminalisation of women, and that this can happen in three main ways. Police will arrive at an incident and they'll get it wrong, and they'll incorrectly identify a woman as the perpetrator. Police will attend at an incident and charge a woman often with criminal offences in a context where she's been using force as resistance in the context of sometimes decades of abuse, violence, coercion and control. Or police will attend at an incident and a woman will get charged with unrelated offences. Maybe there'll be some paraphernalia around or something like that. Maybe the situation will escalate and she'll end up with no protection but a resist police charge. Or she'll be picked up on an outstanding warrant. All of these interactions can result in child removal, job loss, home loss, the loss of housing. And they are also all more likely to be experienced by women who are members of stigmatised and over-policed communities. For example, women who use drugs, women who have acute mental health problems, Aboriginal women and women from newly arrived communities. I'm not going to quote the stats because I'm conscious I might be taking up a little bit too much time, but this is not anecdotal. Research, including research that Fitzroy Legal Service has done, has shown that between 10 and 50% of family violence related incidences, a woman is incorrectly identified as the perpetrator. And what we know is that can lead to a family violence intervention order, a criminalisation through the breach of that order, and further contact with police and incarceration. I think we might, Elena's nodding at me to wrap up, which I can do, and but I reckon I'll riff off some of my friends when we start talking about the solutions.
Beautiful.
Yeah,
Thanks so much.
More
Megan.
homes, less police.
Yes, absolutely. And it is one of those fascinating things that government after government sees a policy of responding to law and order concerns by just upping police numbers. It's a very kind of common response without any thought about what impact that has, either for communities or for the system downstream. But thinking about the impacts of that policing response on women, coming together or converging with some of the other systemic challenges we have on our plate in Victoria at the moment. When we see a woman taken into custody even for one day and losing her children as a result, losing her housing as a result, losing her connection to any supportive gender-informed responses as a result, that certainly creates that carceral churn. Ellie, do you want to talk about one of the biggest systemic issues that we have on our plates at the moment, and that is the bail laws and how that's affecting women in that situation?
Certainly, thank you. And I've just seen some of my colleagues arrive who are much more on the front lines than me, so I hope I don't trip up here. I'm sure they'll correct me if I get little bits of it wrong. But look, a number of you might know that in 2018 in Victoria, there were some sweeping changes to the Bail Act. So the Bail Act is the legislative mechanism through which bail can be granted to people accused of certain offences. And before 2018, there were limited circumstances under which it would be the accused person's responsibility to demonstrate to the court why they should be released. Ultimately, bail exists as a right because to interfere with somebody's liberty by placing them in prison is, fundamentally a breach of their human right to liberty. So it should only occur in very exceptional circumstances. So that's why most people prior to 2018 charged with offences, they'd be charged on summons, they'd be given a court date to attend court to answer their charges, or they'd be bailed from a police station to attend court at a later date. as a result of an inquiry that was triggered by the tragedy in Burke Street in 2018, there were sweeping reforms to the Bail Act which put increased hurdles in place and increased the number of circumstances under which an accused person would bear the onus of proving to the court why they should be released. So the default position was that they would be remanded in custody unless they could demonstrate exceptional circumstances or compelling reasons, depending on what the charges were, as to why they should be released. Now, in introducing these reforms, the rhetoric was around improving community safety. However, what's happened is the net has been cast so wide that it has swept up people who are posing no threat to the community whatsoever. If someone is already on account of bail and they are accused of committing another indictable offence, they are then pushed into the exceptional circumstances category for bail. And that is a category that used to be reserved for only the most serious of charges. So we're looking at terrorism charges, murder charges and trafficking commercial quantities of drugs. So prior to 2018, they were the sorts of offences that would make the accused person have to demonstrate to the court exceptional circumstances. The reforms in 2018 meant that somebody who was on one count of bail, for instance, for a shop theft charge, if they commit another shop theft offence or are accused of committing another shop theft offence, they're then pushed into this exceptional circumstances category, where they've a very high threshold to meet to demonstrate why they should not be remanded in custody until their criminal proceeding has been finalised. So it doesn't require the police to demonstrate that this person poses any real threat to the community or community safety. And it has had hugely disproportionate impacts on vulnerable communities, in particular women, and in particular Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. So those statistics that we heard in the introduction around the increase in the numbers of people on remand, if you look at each of the categories of people that are in our prison system, overall there's about 45% on remand. When you look at women, it goes up to 56% on remand, and when you look at Aboriginal women, it's another 20 to 30% above that again. So clearly these reforms are having a disproportionate impact on women and Aboriginal women. To provide a real life example of how this sort of impacts the work that we do, we're often on the front lines at first remand hearings, appearing on behalf of women who have been charged with an offence and police are seeking to remand them. We have multiple calls every day in relation to women newly in the cells, and just over the past 2 weeks, to demonstrate how ridiculous these provisions are, we've had women facing the exceptional circumstances categories for theft of ice cream from a supermarket, one for cracking a window, not even smashing a window, just cracking it, because she was on counts of bail already. She was charged with criminal damage. She's in exceptional circumstances now. And one Aboriginal woman for stealing meat from a supermarket, who then went and handed herself into police. And yet police were seeking to remand her in custody based on these exceptional circumstances thresholds for bail. So eventually, yes, we did get these women released after a lot of hard work running a bail application in court. And I do want to emphasise that we should centre the impact on these women, the devastating impact of being in this churn system of being in and out of custody and being required to meet these ridiculous thresholds. But from another perspective, what an enormous waste of resources. You have courts who are already buckling under the strain of COVID delays, now dealing with really ridiculous applications to keep people in custody. You have then lawyers that need to be engaged. You have services that all of a sudden have pressure to do things immediately by the end of the day, whereas, you know, a long-term plan is what is needed and real engagement with women in the community. So the bail laws are just having an enormous impact on women, and it's really an area that is ripe for reform.
Thanks so much, Ellie. And of course, the genius of those reforms is, as Ellie said, that they are casting the net so widely and sweeping up and members of vulnerable communities, filtering them from their families, filtering them from their homes, filtering them from their connections. These laws were brought in response to isolated incidents of very violent offending by men. So, you know, go figure. But we're now, of course, having to recognise, I think Ellie's point about the impacts on the system are incredibly important, because we have to recognise this doesn't make sense. It doesn't work as well. It's not achieving the aims that the community might expect. And certainly in our Leaving Custody Behind paper that Megan referenced, and we've got the primary author of that in the audience today, Catherine Caruana, we said that it's not all despair. It is actually possible to think our way out of this corner. We've boxed ourselves in, but it's possible to get out. And that is by kind of coming together as a system across a range of portfolios, so not just saying, oh, that's corrections problem, and that's police's problem, and that's housing's problem, and child protection, stop taking everyone's kids, but thinking it through together. And that needs to happen at a cross-ministerial level, but it also needs to happen kind of on the ground, as Lisa was saying. We've got a little bit of time left, less than 10 minutes, so I've had the sign. So obviously, I'll now work backwards. Obviously, Ellie, bail reform will be top of your list, but are there other areas of sort of systemic reform or systemic thinking that we need to approach, or one wish list that you had, if we're thinking about solutions focused?
I do have a list here. And
oh, she actually does.
I literally have a list. Top of that is bail reform and repealing the reverse onus and double uplift provisions in the Bail Act, and simplifying things just to look at risk and risk to the community as a primary consideration in relation to those bail decisions. But I think everyone on the panel would put at the very top of their list secure and safe housing for women, specific housing for women who've had contact with the criminal justice system, housing that enables access to support that's provided in a holistic way and a non-judgmental way, that it's not about, well, if you fail, off you go, but providing that strong foundation of housing from which, engagement with services will flow.
Yeah. Megan, how about you? We're all going to it's going to get harder because people are going to agree. So I'm just recognising that in advance, that Lisa, you're stuffed. Because people are going to say.
Well, I definitely agree. I do definitely agree. But I was giving some thought to it in the specific context of policing, and I think, I guess the overarching thing I wanted to say though is that, and this has really come through from what people have said, is that any solutions must be driven by women who've been in prison and who are in prison, and them telling us what works, and they've told us what works, and it's things like housing, better supports. And I think another thing that's come through really strongly in the work that I've done alongside women who've been in prison is it's stop criminalising public health problems. So decriminalise, drug use and possession, decriminalise begging, continue with the reforms to decriminalise the offence of public drunkenness, for which Auntie Tanya Day died. Have more opportunities for diversion. So there are really inconsistent powers that police exercise very inconsistently to divert people from the criminal legal system, and there's not much to divert them to. So there's a real cause for investment there. And there's also opportunities to divest from policing and invest in what we might loosely describe as co-responder or alternative responder models, so that we don't have the police as the first port of call for people in crisis. The CIG examined some multidisciplinary response models in a 2016 report. I feel like I'm here plugging this. It's great, yeah, really happy to. Recommended a model where family violence-related call-outs would be co-triaged with VicPol. All of these solutions, though, they have to be location-specific and really heavily informed by what the women in those areas say they want and need. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, Lisa, you're not last cab off the rank. Yeah, Karen, sorry. You're experienced enough to think of something. Lisa, what would you like to see and that you think is actually really achievable?
I absolutely agree. Working in place, and positioning the response and women with lived experience at the centre of that response and learning from that. Collaborative practice across the services. That's pretty low-hanging fruit. You've got a lot of willingness out there across police, legal, justice, health, community. There is an absolute capacity out there in the sector, if it's resourced, to bring all of those players together. And so we can move away, in fact, from that postcode justice. So I was listening to what you were saying, Ali, and, thank goodness that LACWA was there to be able to support the women, because the women in regional courts may not have that response and that advocacy where they're in exceptional circumstances. So I think being able to drive and invest in coordinated, collaborative, cross-sectoral, place-based responses, right across the continuum of need, from diversion through to those exiting prison.
Fantastic, thanks, Lisa. Karen?
Well, since... is that off?
Yeah, it's good.
Since everybody's gone through the low-hanging fruit, I'll just take a slightly different tack. Look, I think that researchers have given us mountains of evidence, and service providers have worked our guts out trying to produce outcomes. I mean, I'll try to give you an idea of what it's like to work it flat out. Our outcome is supposed to be that we're supporting women who are coming out of prison, women, trans and gender diverse folk coming out of prison, from transitional housing into permanent and secure housing. So you would think that the outcome measurement is how many women, trans and gender diverse people do we get out of transitional housing into permanent housing? If we can't get many, it's a reflection on us, isn't it? We're not doing our job. But the fact is there is no, insert swear word here, housing. So we spend all of this time on the phone and in these desperate pursuit for our, and our workers do actually get people housing, but it's sometimes not the most secure, People in these agencies, we're getting people into rooming houses, we're getting them into community housing that volunteers are providing. Like, people are now offering their bedrooms through Husk Housing and other things like that, spare bedrooms for people to go into. Motels, the amount of money that agencies are spending on motels for days and days for people. How can we have these programs that are funding us to provide something that doesn't exist? And there are thousands of workers doing this. It's not just us. So what I want to say is, in terms of solutions, I think this is not because there isn't enough evidence. I don't think it's because the service sector is not producing outcomes because we're lazy or incompetent or whatever it is. I think it's politics. I think we need to go to the public and say, this is a political choice that politicians are making, to say there are bad people and there are good people. And the bad people don't deserve to be housed. They should be evicted, they should be put into prison, they should have to live on the street because they're using drugs to self-medicate, or because they're drinking too much, or because they've had so much trauma that their mental health is a mess. We have to say, no, that's actually not the situation that we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a situation where we've got entrenched trauma that's related to race and the origins of this country, that's related to gender and the role of women in society. A lot of this about how difficult it is for women to get housing is because we're mothers, because we've got children. 70% of women coming out of prison are primary carers for children. And that is the reason that so many of the agencies that are supposed to be providing housing for women coming out of prison, who are funded, mind you, on the whole by corrections, say that they can't house them because they can't take children in housing that's meant for ex-prisoners. It's not suitable. So they're putting them into child protection, into out-of-home care, residential, resi homes. and with people they don't know, foster carers that they're running away from and then getting put into juvenile detention because they're running away from foster care. And that's because there's no housing where their mums can live with them. I've got a worker at the moment, absolutely beside herself for weeks, trying to get kids who want to be with their mum, reunited with their mum, with a parole board who says, well, they can't because there's not enough bedrooms in the housing that's there. And we can't get any other kind of housing because, you know, look, I could spontaneously combust right here. So yeah, I mean, all hats off to the research, all hats off to the service providers and all the collaboration and all of that. But at some point we have to say that this is not about evidence.
Yep, absolutely. Well, it's about using evidence, isn't it? Rather than the evidence exists, but it's about actually acknowledging it and trying to incorporate it. But it's not just an Australian problem. The international community came together a long time ago, 10 years ago, with recognition across from a human rights perspective for precisely the reasons that you described, Karen, through something that's called the Bangkok Rules, which acknowledges that the imprisonment of women, and particularly women with children, should be absolutely considered as the absolute last resort, and recognising the damaging effects that it is having on not just the current generation but on future generations, which we absolutely know. So we need to think.
Which I think is, yeah, I think that's a political point that we should start to use more. I mean, there was a recent inquiry into the impact of parental incarceration on children, and it, you know, because of the effectiveness of this thing about bad people and good people, and so children are the innocent victims, whereas their mothers are bad women. You actually get a little bit more public support and politician support for doing something for the kids, and they're realising that putting them into residential care or out of home care is causing intergenerational pipeline into juvenile detention and the increase in the adult population. So I think that is a political point that we could start to use more and could get us some traction. I also just wanted to say that one example of how evidence is having an impact, and I certainly don't want to say that it's not worth producing the evidence, because I was gobsmacked to read the Productivity Commission's report on the housing and homelessness partnership between the Commonwealth and the states, where they have concluded that the best bang... So the Productivity Commission is not what you would call a bleeding heart or radical organisation. They work out how you get the best bang for your buck from taxpayer dollars, and they said the best bang for the taxpayer's buck on housing is to house people coming out of prison. And it should be on a housing first basis that doesn't require people to be abstaining from alcohol and other drugs. And then you would get all the flow-on effects. You get less crime, you get less injuries, you get better mental health, you get kids who are not, you know, going into care. That's where you put your money, and that's what the economists are saying too.
Well, if the economists are saying it, then it must be right. Thank you, everyone. We've gone over time, so I just want to thank you all very much for your time tonight.
Thank you very much to all of the panel. That was fantastic. Some really, some people really know their stuff and giving us some really great energy and ideas for how we can move forward. So thank you very much. We're going to have a break now. So we'll come back at about 5 to 7. So there's food and drinks up the back. And for those of you at home, please do come back. Okay, bye-bye.
I didn't think I was going to do that.
Hey, if everyone can make their way back to their seats, please. We're going to get started. Can you make your way back to your seat, please? Okay, we've got a few stragglers. Okay, thank you everyone. We're going to start the second panel discussion now. If you could just make your way, please, to your chairs. Okay. So thank you. I hope you all enjoyed your break. And I'm sure you're looking forward to the next panel where we'll hear from women with lived experience of incarceration and carceral resistance. I think the panel members are going to come up while I'm speaking now, is that right? But the moderator for this panel is Nina Story. Nina is an unapologetic criminalised survivor. Having experienced state-sanctioned violence, she now spends her time advocating the rights of criminalised survivors. Nina would love to see the abolishment of the prison industrial complex in her lifetime. Her systemic advocacy commenced in 2018 as a member of the Women's Transforming Justice project that you have heard of already. Nina now sits on the Victim Survivor Advisory Council. She's a member of the expert advisory panel at Safe and Equal. She's a weaver, which is a group that with people with lived experience who help with research at Melbourne University. And she sits on the steering committee of the Homes Not Prisons campaign. Nina stands in solidarity with the traditional owners of these lands and acknowledges that they have the solutions to living in a world of unity. She believes we must make more space and elevate their voices for their stories to be told and shared. Nina lives, works and plays in Millau, which is the Bunurong name for Phillip Island, with her son and her kelpie. So over to you, Nina.
Is that on? I think that's on. Yeah, that's on. Yeah, thanks everyone and welcome back after the intermission. Thanks Christine for the introduction. My name is Nina and I'm really privileged to be sitting amongst friends and colleagues, and I've got Jazz, Jackie and Sarah online. We're all women with lived experience of incarceration, and we're going to have a really informal discussion today. And just want to say as well, really know what Megan was saying with being nervous and not being able to hide behind our screens. So I have the privilege of hiding behind my screen anyway, which is great for me. So we're just going to have a discussion today about the complexities of incarcerated women in women's lives, and I would like to take a moment to say that we're in Naarm, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are 21 more times likely to be incarcerated than non-Indigenous women, and also acknowledge that we do not have a First Nations person on the panel today. When we talk about decarceration and carceral resistance, we recognise that it is the first and foremost project of a decolonisation and sovereignty for First Nations people. So I'll introduce the speakers today. Jackie, who's in the pink jacket, is a formerly incarcerated woman who has worked with Fitzroy Legal Service as part of the Women's Leadership Group. She lives with anxiety and mental health concerns and has previously struggled with substance dependency and homelessness. Jackie is deeply passionate about working alongside other criminalised people with a particular interest in supporting women to navigate child protection. Jackie is a warm advocate, loyal friend and proud single mum. And then we've got Sarah on screen. Sarah is an active member of several community groups and organisations aimed to ending incarceration, including Homes Not Prisons Steering Committee member, and previously as part of the Fitzroy Legal Service Women's Transforming Justice project as well. Sarah has lived experience of criminalisation and incarceration. She's driven towards social change and is a fierce advocate for abolishing the carceral system and its supporting structures, which only serve to perpetuate further harm and violence to exerting power and control over people's lives. Alongside studying a bachelor degree of social science, Stara stands in solidarity with oppressed women and continues to fight for the rights of women and children. And then I've got Jazz, who's next to me. Jazz Bazani is an Iranian Kurdish troublemaker based in Naam. She's an anti-facet prison abolitionist, no-border activist and criminology student at Melbourne University. She's currently working on a documentary film called Bendigo Street, which discusses the coloniality of the housing system. She's currently fundraising to turn the 20-minute short film into a feature length, and you can contribute by donating online. Jasmine's a steering group member at Homes Not Prisons and supporter of Boycott, Divest, Sanction movement, and she pays the rent, and would also encourage anyone who's not paying the rent to also do the same. So just would like to again thank everyone for coming today, and I think we'll start firstly by going to Jackie, and we're going to talk about the digital footprint and what that means for incarcerated women. So digital footprint is things like what follows us around, because technology is so rife, so it includes things like what we have on our socials, anything that can be used as evidence against us, mandatory reporting, and of course our records, because like the previous speakers said, our records really discriminate against us and prevent us from moving around as people who are non-criminalised. It just prevents us from accessing services and being linked in with other things. So, Jackie, we know that you're particularly passionate about working alongside women and that have interacted with the child protection system. Can you tell us a little bit more about what a digital footprint is and how it impacts the lives of women and children?
Hi everyone. Just before I start, I just want to explain very quickly. I'm having a lot going on in my life at the moment, so if I forget my name, excuse me. I've got a very sick puppy and I've just moved home all this weekend, so I'll do my very best, but I could forget some stuff. Okay, so I just put this all down definitely to surveillance. It's something that we all face, whether we've been criminalised or not. It starts from the moment we're born, with birth certificates and Medicare cards and everything else that they do. Although women, peoples, but especially women and children that have been criminalised are affected by this in every matter of their lives. So, sorry, I've just drawn a blank already. That's really bad. I have really gone blank. Excuse me, can I just, I've taken some notes because my head is so bad at the moment. I had a feeling this would happen. I'm really sorry, everyone. So there's once I get started, I'll probably be okay, but it's around like services colluding, taking your data, and then just, I'm blank. Nina, can you help me? You're good. It's okay, I'll get it. I'm just so sorry. I had a feeling this might happen and I was really concerned about it, but that's okay. I just might read a little bit from what I've written because that's pretty much me anyway. It's a human rights issue and we have no control over what happens with our surveillance impacting on our human rights, being paralysed by a system we have no control of. In my case and in a lot of people that have been criminalised case, not all, being a ward of the state, it's from that, and then your name's taken and documented, and then throughout like the police, and then it's documented through that, and now we have CCTV, which is an issue. Everything's just blank. I'm really blank. I can't do this. No, I really... Yeah. Yeah, do you want to talk to it for a little while?
Yeah, no, I think you're doing great, Jackie, and you've really outlined too, and I think it's a real... I just want to acknowledge too that... I just want to acknowledge too that it's really, really difficult as a woman with criminalisation to be sitting up here in a really, really daunting space, and like, you know, to have these lights and microphones, and like, you know, I think too, for lived experience people, sometimes the audience expects what I call trauma porn, and like they really want to feed off a story, and you know, and I think it's hard to sometimes remove your own personal experience and just talk about it in a really general way, and it's really hard to sometimes find your words. And I think like it, from our experiences, having that digital footprint attached to us and having to continually protect your innocence and tell your story over and over again to make sure that you're not being discriminated against, or, you know, to be stigmatised, it can be really, really challenging. So
Services making you follow. Sorry, I'll help if I can. That might be a bit better.
Yeah.
Services also like making you stick to a certain criteria, or you don't fit them, and then they'll move you on to someone else. And if you don't fit that, then you put back into the system, especially when it's criminalised matters. I'll just give a quick example of something that I'll just say for myself, and this is a bit of trauma in the sense, but this is something I can give because it's something in my heart. There was once upon a time that I had been out of the criminal justice system for 12 years, and I reached out to a service because I was struggling with some stuff, and I was concerned with reaching out around surveillance and stuff because I thought, okay, what if they contact my daughter's school? What if they start like pulling up my history? I'm going to be really stuffed. Like, even though I'd been out of trouble for 12 years, I still had that fear. And that's so bad, because that stops women, especially, from reaching out, because they're scared of losing their children. They're scared of what's going to come from that. And everything I was scared of ended up showing itself. As soon as I was speaking to them, I said, look, I understand you've got a duty of care. I haven't relapsed, but the thought is there and I'm scared, so I need some support. And they're like, okay, no, this should be fine. This doesn't really encroach on our duty of care. The next morning, I had the DHHS, they always change their names, I still remember them as CSV, knocking on the door, coming in, wanting to speak to my daughter after school. It was so traumatic. And I've now sworn that if I'm ever struggling, I will never reach out to a service like that again. They put me through drug screens and everything, and I had not used, and it's not the point, even if someone has relapsed, that's not going to help them. That's just going to make them fall more into a deep hole. They're asking for help. Isn't that what this is about? Aren't we meant to be supporting women to get to a better place, or the place they want to be, even if that place is using, as long as their children are safe, they're doing, meeting certain things, isn't that all that matters? And they're not like, offending, as in this, how the law or parliament looks at it. I think that's the main thing, but it's not. We've got to all, and this is where services, like some services have got really good hearts in good place, but when there's government in that service a lot of the time, they've got to tick these boxes and meet these needs, and that's not how our lives work at all. Like, it's insane. And all services collude, and, you sign that form when you get in with them, and they'll collude with each other, and you just have to say one thing. So you're constantly on the back foot, fearful. What if I say something that doesn't fit into them? For example, and this has got nothing to do with being criminalised, and I'll be really quick, I co-slept with my daughter for quite many years, and I was always fearful to say something to them. And it had a little bit to do with my history as well, because I'm like, okay, so I smoke cigarettes, and I have had a history of drug abuse, but even people that co-sleep get judged anyway. But I was scared, okay, so that's going to get me to the department. So there's always that constant what if. So you're constantly never wanting to be honest, which leaves your mental health in a really bad place if it's not already in a bad place. And that's really traumatic. And it's not helpful for our children either, because we feel unable to talk. And sorry to keep going back to kids, but it is something I'm really passionate about. If we're unable to talk, then, that sends us, and that we're possibly more going to go to using and more going to what we know to cope. And then obviously the whole cycle starts again of being criminalised. And for me, I'm not only speaking for myself here, but it's a very generational thing. When Karen was speaking, I was like going, yes, because it's that whole generational thing, that my family, then, you know, their drug abuse, their mental health, into custody. Then I, you know, got older, same sort of thing, because, you know, wardship and trauma that came from that. And, you know, my family was the surveillance. So it's not a new thing, it's constant. And even, you know, like going to the shops, like, you know, we're being surveilled, and it's getting worse, it's not getting better. And for us that are criminalised, you know, you've got, you know, say methadone programs, you're surveilled with that. And if any court, jail, police want to find anything on us, it's like that. Even if we haven't done anything wrong, you know, they come banging on your door sometimes just because you're criminalised and you're known in the system. And then that affects the children. And, you know, there's just, it's actually heartbreaking, and it's that constant fear and that constant what if for criminalised women. And it just leaves you end up isolating and too fearful to do anything, because what if? And, you know, what if does show itself that many times. And especially after that thing happened with Child Protection Services, I was going, not completely, but to people I knew, and I was in part of the women's leadership group at this time, I'm like, don't reach out, be really careful. So then I'm putting that out because it wasn't a good experience. And this isn't help, you know, this isn't what it should be. It should be a good experience. You should be able to reach out, and that could have been something really helpful for me and my child, and made, you know, but again, I had to walk it alone, and I have come through it. But it did cause a lot more trauma, and then, you know, I ended up having to get my daughter into, it's actually called Big Sister, Big Brother, but it's like almost a service in a sense, and I'm fearful with that because it's like her name's on a system now. I'm constantly fearful of my child's name being on a system. So I avoid anything that could possibly put her on a system or register her with anybody. Even being my own child, it's fearful because she's like on a system as being my child on Centrelink and stuff. And, you know, and I've heard of other people that have been imprisoned and stuff, you know, they get picked up just for being somebody's child. And I'm not saying I'm that notorious or anything like that, but it doesn't matter. If you're known, it just happens like that. And you know what, and I don't mean to say it like this, but this is the thought to come to my head. What hope do they have if this is what's in front of them? It's just insanity. And, you know, I always say to my daughter, I actually spoke to the school about getting the police out there to do a talk, to make, because they don't do it, they used to do it when we were kids, but they don't do it much, to, you know, make her feel safe, to approach them and stuff like that. Even though that's my absolute, like, don't do, I want that for her. So why can the system not understand that we're trying here, and to, like, support us and not be so, you know, kick us in when we're down, I guess. But I guess I've sort of gone a bit all over the shop and not probably dealt with the digital footprint too much.
No,
but,
you have, and I think that was great. And, like, you know, it's really nice.
Sorry.
That, you know, once you got over those nerves, the words just came flying out. And I really want to just touch on too that sector collusion. Like, it really, really impacts us. And like what Karen touched on too, services just aren't equipped to deal with the complexities of our lives. And, you know, we go into one service provider asking for something, and before you know it, you're being referred out to another service, and the list just goes on. And, like, you know, these services are colluding with those services, and you may have gone somewhere just to get a food relief, and before you know it, you've got DHS and AOD and all sorts of, and then you experience sector fatigue, because all you're doing is doing all of this hoop jumping to try and get children back in your care, or try and get a little bit of financial assistance, and you are just absolutely exhausted going from one service to the other, and no one's actually providing you with relief, and you just find that you're just ticking these boxes in order to get somewhere and not really getting anywhere, exerting yourself even more, and more than not, and in my personal experience, I ended up turning to drugs because I was like, I actually cannot cope.
It's traumatic.
It's really traumatic. Yeah. And, you know, in my experience, I went to, my first engagement was because of DV, and once I engaged with cops, which I highly recommend for criminalised women, don't go to cops, because then you become targeted. My drug use came out, my household was targeted, and before you knew it, there was no response to my DV experience, and I was just completely targeted as a drug user and went into the prison industrial complex. So thanks very much, Jackie. And do you want to say anything else to it, Jazz?
I can briefly. Thank you so much, both of you, like, amazing. I do just want to bring up how racialized people experience this stuff, because there is a huge targeting of African and First Nations people when it comes to racist algorithms. And Flemington Kensington Legal Centre, they released a really awesome report recently called Predictive Policing, which demonstrates how police technologies target certain areas in communities that are homes to, migrants, home to people of colour, First Nations people, and that is the primary reason why we have so many people of colour and First Nations people dying at the hands of police in the state. So it is really important to think about the kind of unilateral power of these big, new empires like Facebook and Google, who cooperate with governments and provide exorbitant amounts of metadata that are then analysed and used against us, and how this relates to histories of colonialism and surveillance towards First Nations people by controlling their movements, controlling where they go, monitoring them, criminalising their movements, and how that also relates to borders and other white supremacist institutions.
Thanks, Jazz. Sarah, can you hear us okay?
Yep, can you hear me okay?
Oh, did you explain to surveillance in the digital footprint conversation?
Yeah, but can you hear me okay first?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Fine. Okay. No, I feel like everything's been covered by the three of you just then, and I don't feel like I can add any more, because what's been said is 100% true, and I feel the same, right? So, with surveillance, it has a really, lifelong and detrimental impact to all of us. We lose our children, as has been said. We end up not being able to get employment. We end up not being able to find housing. We end up not being able to move forward with our lives when we're trying. So we end up falling backwards. And I just think, with Centrelink and with other, forms of surveillance, that really needs to start being, looked at as a deterrent and a form of harm and form of abuse, really, for what it's doing to the disadvantaged community.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And I think, we've touched on, not being able to access supports in community then leads to a pipeline to prison. And I think in particular, not having our mental health, homelessness and AOD and being people of colour is a direct cause to be targeted by police and then end up in the justice system. And, I think that in certain circumstances, prisons are almost seen as a solution to these problems. So rather than having your AOD issues addressed, you get thrown into prison as a detox facility. Rather than getting support for your mental health or your housing needs, you just get placed into prison. And I think that's, a question for Sarah. What sorts of resources would you like to see available in community to prevent women from being incarcerated? And what do we need in our communities at the grassroots to make sure that no one else gets locked up?
Thanks for that leadway into that question, Nins. I feel like, it's already been touched on with the first panel. Karen touched on it as well around, the lack of housing. It's actually really ridiculous to have all these housing services and, try to say, they're known to have or to be housing services and meant to be having these resources available to people, but they don't have them. So, you can't send people to somewhere, you're sending them to a dead end, and I feel like, housing is predominantly crucial and pretty much number one resource, community resource. Public housing that is, you're not at risk of having recurring homelessness. You're not at risk because you're in a domestic violent relationship. The person who is in that house has that house in their name and they can't lose that housing. But that what comes with that as well, we can't isolate people. We need to have community. We need to have people around us supporting us. We need to have support around, regardless of whether people want to abstain from substances or whether they want to use, but, reduce the harm. We need to be able to provide support for that. We need to remove consequences to absolutely every single aspect of every single like supportive factor. Like whenever you go out to try to get support, there's a consequence attached if you're not following something, you're not conforming to a certain policy or certain whatever law regime, whatever it is out there. You know, there's always consequences, which puts people again in places of fear, in places of isolation, and putting people more and more at harm of trauma and abuse. You know, and I think what needs to really be at a grassroots level is community, you know, community unity, right? And I feel like, you know, that's really at the forefront of really having thriving communities, right? Because when you've got connection, you've got meaning and purpose, you've got resources like food, you know, safe homes, safe housing, you've got, you know, loved ones around you, like whether they're friends, whether they're your children, your family, you know, whoever those people are around you, you know, you've got services that are there to support you and willing to walk alongside you, not pull you over here, push you over there and tell you, you know, you need to do this, otherwise this is the consequence. You know, having people actually there with you, you know, it would remove the disadvantage almost immediately, you know, and I think that's what needs to happen, right? Because we live in a capitalist society, and this capitalist society is making people go nowhere. We're all falling down through the cracks, and we're all living really, really struggling, you know, financially to make ends meet, paying predominantly all our money on rent and, you know, now petrol and whatever, everything, pretty much the cost of living is everything that, you know, we're trying to pay for and trying to get by in this world is, you know, really, really challenging, because we can't, like, from my experience, you know, I've struggled with poverty for my whole entire life. You know, I'm probably in a better position today than I've ever been because I've actually got employment, which I'm blessed to have, right? But before that, you know, the struggle was real. You know, the amount of money that I was paying for rent was all the Centrelink money that I was getting, right? And then it'll leave me with $60 a fortnight. What am I supposed to do with that? You know, and then when people are really struggling, or they've got unresolved, you know, mental health challenges, they've got underlying trauma that's never been addressed, they're constantly reliving, you know, the same struggle, the same survival lifestyle, you know, because they're trying to get through day-to-day life. They're using substances because, well, it's a way to cope around how to get away from yourself because you're not happy with yourself, right? So what are you going to do? You're going to demolish yourself, really, right? Because you're already struggling in a society that's already literally feels like it's hating on you and you can't get out, you know? So, you know, the substances aren't the issue. And I always go back to the issue of the war on the drugs is the issue, not, you know, the substance use, right? It's because there's a laws around that then they're criminalized, which is what's causing, you know, the issues around that. What needs to be looked at is the underlying stuff that's living there and that follows the person even when they're not using substances, right? So I just feel like, sorry, I'm going on a tangent, and again, I could just waffle on too, but like 100%, I feel like it all starts with community, unity, and having the resources available, and not, you know, having the actual like infrastructure like of housing, having material aid, having things available and accessible to people and their children, and removing the consequences. Consequences need to be abolished. Gone. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I love that community and unity, and you know, I can't echo enough that like when we engage with services, there are huge consequences. So we just either self-police and don't tell our whole story because it's detrimental to our engagements and the supports that we receive, or we just don't engage, and that then brings us further and further into the shadows and isolates us from community, and we don't belong, and we're left to fend for ourselves, which is really detrimental. And then like only once we start getting a little bit like, you know, it's that classic case of it's not what you know, it's who you know. And then if somebody believes in you and gives you the time and the space and, you know, just that little bit of support, and you can start building on that, then that's when, you know, things start to change for criminalised women. And the baseline is housing. And like, you know, we're coming up to an election now, so I strongly encourage you to put your vote in for people, for politicians that are supporting community and not funding police and not funding prisons, because so much money is getting pumped into those areas and they're detrimental to me, to you and to our communities. So I've also got a question about the Victorian bail laws. As we heard the first panel speak, that it's had a direct impact to criminalise women, and I just wanted to know your views on the bail laws.
Well, you want to know my views. I reckon 100% that is the most traumatic, policy-driven thing that I think that I have actually ever seen or heard. That's literally just put the red tape there to make sure that every single person who fronts the criminal legal system and fronts court is then, and the police is then pretty much handballed straight. When you go to the police, you handballed straight to the court system, and then you put into jail, right? And I think that is not okay. Like, what kind of policy or what kind of person, because of a man who killed 6 people by driving through Burke Street and doing what he did, right, then ends up damaging the lives of so many more people because of the fact that we cannot show exceptional circumstances to get bail. You know, I can't say that, you know, my homelessness and my children and, you know, all these different factors that are, you know, predominantly, you know, where there should be support around, you know, isn't enough to say, no, you shouldn't be incarcerated. It's pretty much, no, these are the reasons why you're getting incarcerated. You know, so like, it's like, because you're homeless, you're going to jail. You know, these are things like, it's ridiculous. And I think, you know, that many women and the ripple effect that that has on the people that around them, you know, these bail laws have had, you know, as was said before about, you know, somebody stealing ice cream or something like that. Like, come on, is this a society that we're living in? Is this the bullshit society that we have? You know, like, how actually sad is that? You know, when people are going to that extreme to get ice cream or to get certain things, there's obviously underlying reasons why that's happening. Predominantly financial hardship, right? And somebody's hungry and somebody likes ice cream, right? You know, and that's, why has that got to be a crime? And somebody's got to go to prison for that, you know? And I think, yeah, I think the bail laws are absolutely like shocking, and I just don't understand why we have this system that actually thinks that it's okay to do what it's doing and thinks that prisons are okay, because prisons are a traumatic institution that is designed to really continue to exacerbate further control, abuse, harm, and exacerbate the already underlying traumas that, you know, most women have already endured in their life. You know, it doesn't do anything. It does not rehabilitate. It does not, you know, it is not a place for detox. It is not a place for, it's not a home. You know, like, we can't lock people up and say that this is addressing any of these underlying issues, because it's not. It's just band-aiding it. And I really think that with the bail law, like the bail laws, I really think it's just a poor excuse to keep the prison industrial complex going. So it's bullshit. It's killing people, and, you know, families and children and you know, women and also men. You know, lives are, and youth, you know, lives are being destroyed, and it's not okay. It's a monster of a system. And yeah, anyway, yeah, it pisses me right off. So that's what I've got to say about that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And for those, I think most of the people in the audience would know that Dame Phyllis Frost currently is has got over half the women sitting on remand because of the bail laws, which is absolutely horrendous. And the security that these women did have prior to entering the prison, their children in their custody, housing support, they may have had employment, they may have had, you know, whatever they had in their lives, when they are sent to remand and sitting in custody, more often than not, they come back to absolutely nothing. And then they have to go through these services and try and find adequate housing and be reunified with their children. And as we've heard today, services are at capacity, and so like you end up doing exactly what has already been mentioned. You end up stealing food because you've got absolutely no way of putting food on the table for your kids, and the cycle continues, which is an absolute horrendous nightmare. I'm now going to go to Jazz. As a woman of colour who has lived experience of incarceration, what would you like to talk about today?
A lot. I don't know where to begin. Probably would like to begin by acknowledging that we're on Wurundjeri country. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and that the current criminal legal system, including everything that was discussed before, you know, it's originated in colonialism and it continues through white supremacist colonial patriarchy. And unless we start talking about abolition, we're not going to solve these issues. That's what I want to start off with. I also want to really hugely thank everyone on this panel who has been so extremely brave to talk about their experiences. Yeah, it's a super tricky thing to do. I think it's like we need to remember and acknowledge that doing that puts your life on the line, right? You lose opportunities, your family finds out, all that surveillance stuff that we were talking about earlier. And the more marginalized and disadvantaged you are, the more is at stake talking about these things. You can risk never being allowed to go back to your home country and a lot of other really detrimental consequences. So yeah, I think that's really important to remember. On that note, I think it's really important as well to think and talk about spaces and the white supremacy in spaces. So with this panel, this event, you know, I love Fitzroy Legal Service. They were, you know, really involved in the Bendigo Street campaign, and they've done so much amazing work, and a lot of organisations similar to like Flemken and you know, Flat Out, and all these amazing organisations do such good work. And I don't know really what happened behind the scenes, so I don't want to, you know, claim to know what arrived at this situation. But apart from myself, and I don't want to also discount Sarah, who's a Lebanese Greek woman who also has been invisibilised, which often happens with fair-skinned people. So want to acknowledge that, but I'm the only outwardly woman of colour on this panel. Also, the panel earlier was, I'm not completely sure of everyone's background, but no one in the previous panel talked about racialisation, their own personal experience of racialisation, so I assumed that everyone was white. And that is a huge problem because we need to have a much more intersectional approach when it comes to these things. So, yeah, yeah. And you know, it's not just because of this like liberal representative politics of like, hi, we need to have more brown people on the stage. No, it's not about that. It's about power, right? So I'm not going to stand here and tell you about my lived experience as these brave women have done, because I don't need to talk about my lived experience to a bunch of people who have more power than me, right? What I need is more decision-making power. And people with lived experience often, you know, get invited because, like you said, trauma porn, people want to hear of how hard it's been, this and that. But that's not what I need from everybody here today. I'd like to be taken seriously. Everyone else with a lived experience would like to be taken seriously. We'd like to, you know, have a say about policies. We'd like to have a say about how we think things need to be changed. And on that note, how we think things need to be changed, there's a lot of different things, but as I stated a little bit earlier, I'd like abolition to be less of a dirty word. Yeah, and you know, there's so many amazing lawyers and professionals and academics and intellectuals doing all of this amazing work. You know, when talking about the bail reforms, for example, right? So what I would like to see done, you know, they're like, okay, change the reverse onus provisions and, you know, make the exceptional circumstances threshold, incorporate less things, incorporate less violent offences, right? And that's all great, and it's good to talk about reform, but we need to be talking about reform in terms of how is this reform leading and contributing to an eventual goal of abolition, right? Because it's really easy to be like, oh, the bail legislation needs to be reformed. But what we need to realise is that these laws were created in the first place to dispossess Indigenous people of their lands. And unless we think of a way to completely get rid of this carceral system, we're not going to actually have long change, and we're not going to change the, conditions and the deaths of Aboriginal people today. And yeah, I really appreciate Karen bringing up Palm Island as well. I think this is a question you're going to ask later, I know. But yeah, having more people with different experiences, different racialized experiences, means that we are just able to think of how to better change diversity of things. So a huge thing that's been missed today as well and hasn't been discussed has been the refugee experience. So Karen, you brought up Palm Island. We need to think about how that is being continued. That white supremacy is being continued today through, racist nationalist policies that have incarcerated, thousands of people from, for absolutely no reason whatsoever. So that's another thing I think to think about. It's not just through the criminal legal system. There are people who are incarcerated in psychiatric facilities, right? So constantly always focusing on the criminal legal system, and this liberal reformist position is not going to stop incarceration. At the moment in Iran, which is where I'm from, we have hundreds of people being slaughtered by a theocratic, fascist, colonial, so-called Iranian state. And, they have none of this, these ideas of rights or these ideas of following the rule of law, which we have, right? But it's still happening, people are still, Kurdish people are being murdered and slaughtered and incarcerated for absolutely no reason whatsoever. So I think that's really important to think about, that carceral regimes are an international thing. It's a colonial thing which exists all over the world, and it's not going to change by constantly referring to liberal reformist ideas about justice, harm, violence, and accountability.
Thanks, Jazz.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that to think about, and it really is, it starts very, very early in schools when we're made to wear uniforms and abide by all of these sorts of standards, and to segregate us from each other, and not to trust one another, and have really punitive responses to when for instance, you do something wrong and you're made to go and sit in the naughty corner, and all of that punishment, it starts really, really early on. And I think that we really need to start coming together as human beings and trusting one another in order to move forward. Really, really great points. And I really love that you touched on abolition. I think that whenever I talk about abolition, I always get the response, well, what about the murderers and what about the pedophiles? And it just infuriates me, because I think that that's just such a fear-based response. And if I look at countries like Hawaii, who at the moment have managed to empty out all of their women's and children's prisons because of all of the support and the redirected funding that they've put into community rather than into prisons, and really started addressing and looking at why people are being incarcerated and supporting people's journeys. And in the Netherlands as well, they are starting to really close down the whole prison industrial complex and empty out prisons there. And I think that that's, a huge move. I just wanted to touch on too, what Jazz said about us being really vulnerable up here on stage. And I've really publicly started, because I wear, for instance, this jumper around a lot, and I live out rural, and it's new area to me, and like friends from my new engagements and my son's school come up to me and ask me about the campaign and, you know, say, well, why are you interested? And I'll just bomb it and be like, oh, because I went to jail. And they're like, and like, you know, and I just think that, like, you know, I no longer hide behind that fear, and I want people to know my story because I'm not ashamed that the system failed me. I'm not ashamed that I couldn't get the supports that I needed and ended up where I ended up. So I guess that takes me to my last question of when we're talking about abolition, it'd be really, really good to hear from the audience, what does a world without prisons look like to you?
Now, I think we've got a microphone. Thank you all, that was fantastic. Is there anyone got a question? Thank you. Do you want to repeat the question, please?
What does a world without prisons look like to you?
Someone up the front here? Oh, yeah.
Hey, thanks for asking that question and putting the onus back on us, the audience, because we are we need to be doing a lot more, all of us. So a world without prisons to me means that there is no, I'm from the States, so I have a very, my view is, there's a lot happening there. So, but I think education plays a huge part. There is a huge school-to-prison pipeline in the US. A world without prisons means that children are not being criminalized in the classroom. A world without prisons means that our cities are walkable. People are, there's more a community vibe, I guess, in our neighborhoods, right? A world without prisons means that there is economic mobility for people of color. And I'm right here with you, Jazz. When you talk about abolition, I am a full supporter of that, and it's not a dirty word. And I think that people are really scared to say things like defund the police or divest from the police. So yeah, for me, a world without prisons will address a lot of the issues that prisons are trying to solve, that police are trying to solve now. Thanks.
Thank you. I think there was someone just a couple of rows back. Oh, there was. Someone still got their hand up? Yep. Down to Karen.
Just very briefly, just to get people talking. A world without prisons for me is a world where we take responsibility for each other and for ourselves rather than just assigning that job to people with guns that are going to stand and hold them to people's heads and make them do what they want them to do, or lock them in cells, close the cell, lock it and put a sign on the door that says this cell is not to be opened, and leave people there for days, weeks, months, sometimes years, thereby completely taking absolutely no responsibility for the issues that they are thinking that those prisons are dealing with.
Up the front.
Hey, so a world without prisons to me, and just like you lovely ladies, I've also experienced being in the system, and everything that everyone has said tonight resonates with me so hard because it's been my experience too. So a world without prisons to me means all of that money, that copious amount of money that's being spent on stuff that doesn't work actually gets reinvested into the social sector, into housing, into all of those supports that we so desperately need in society. It means that we build that community, we learn to help each other pick up the pieces where someone can't. You know, it will build a better, more cohesive and just a happier society. People will get that connection that they really need. There'll be less of that, you're going to stay locked in the room because you've been bad. It's going to be, well, you are struggling. How can we help you? So it's all of that. Thank you.
Some great points.
I guess when I think of getting rid of prisons, I also think about what are the criminal offences that we have in our criminal justice system and where do they arise? So we have a lot of criminalisation around, for example, theft, and then you have drugs. And if you kind of look at all of it, kind of also goes towards private property and capitalism and not sharing our resources. You know, housing's a huge issue, but why are there like 1 million homes in Australia that are not being used? And why are there laws that allow people to accumulate homes and we, you know, live on stolen land? And it's just, I think there's a lot to think about structures, right? And how we got to this place and looking at, I think often, you know, with housing we talk about the issue of supply, but, you know, I think it's about the allocation of resources and who has the power, who's in control of these resources. And a lot of, you know, like offending relates to economic disadvantage, I think is a strong underlying, you know, cause, and that relates once again to not being able to access education, health, housing, and that's all resources really. So I think, you know, I think that's something that needs to be looked at, and I think a world without prisons means that we share our resources.
Thank you.
Just while you're walking over there, oh sorry, I didn't realise that you had a mic on the other end. I just wanted to quickly add, like, abolishing prisons to me also means abolishing the system. So, like, you know, what we're educated in schools, and that academically, if you don't make it, you'll fail, will be challenged and eradicated, and, like, you know, we will be taught conflict resolution and how to have healthy and supportive relationships and how to be self-sustaining and how to grow food and live away from the system. And you know, when we do see conflict, we're not afraid to step in and say, hey, like, what's going on here? Do you need some support? Or, like, you know, and to not have that whole fear basis around if, you know, like, you know, I have so many friends that are like, oh my God, you pick up hitchhikers? Like, you know, I don't have that fear to people because I've, I guess, surrounded myself with people that might look like they're challenged. But I think that, like, you know, everybody could do with a handout every now and then. And, like, you know, we really need to start supporting one another rather than judging and stigmatising. And yeah, so that's what it looks like to me.
It's that whole village thing.
Yeah.
I think a world without prisons is no more us and them narratives, which is so commonly utilised by politicians to continually drive funding to police and the criminal justice system that dehumanises the experiences that lead up to criminalisation and just focuses on the end product and drives a wedge between, like, the people that go through those systems. Yeah.
Okay, any more hands? Happy to take a question? Yep.
I thought it was really curious that sex work hasn't been talked about at all, and I just wanted, I was just curious what your thoughts, I mean, now it's being decriminalized, or is decriminalized in Victoria, but yeah, can you speak to that?
Yes, definitely. Sex work is another one of those things that is very difficult for people who are actual sex workers to talk about publicly, but it you know, so much amazing work has been done by sex workers and sex worker activists to decriminalise it in Victoria, but it hasn't actually been decriminalised, as street work is still criminal. And I think that's like a really good example of how, you know, activist efforts can often sideline or compromise with the bargaining with politicians when, you know, you can make a win that benefits white middle-class people at the expense of poor black and brown people who work in St Kilda at night and risk their lives just so that they can get by. You'll do that, right? Because it benefits who's in already the positions of power. So unfortunately, yeah, that hasn't been fully decriminalised, but hopefully it will be eventually. And there's a lot of other things that should be decriminalised, basically everything. But you know, you can start small and kind of, build to the bigger picture. Drug decriminalised. I think marijuana got decriminalised, or no, possession in ANU. Oh, sorry, ANU, Canberra, University, but yeah. I don't know if anyone else wants to say anything.
I just want to echo too that it's like, it's not the tough on crime, it's tough on poverty. Like, you know, it's, who are we criminalising? Not everybody. Just people from low economic...
to survive.
Yeah,
it's the survival
marginalised
crimes.
communities,
Yeah.
Thanks for the question.
Okay, we might have time for one more comment. Yes.
I think a world without prisons is, particularly in Australia, recognition about the intergenerational effects of trauma and the country that the premise that this country was founded on. You know, 5 generations ago, my maternal lineage was sent over here for pinching apples, I think. So this is a very long intergenerational wound, and I think that hasn't been discussed enough.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, we might draw a line under the questions now. That's kind of rounding off the evening. I want to thank everyone so much for coming tonight. And I've just been pondering on, you know, thinking about the amount of amazing political placards we could have made tonight if we'd had our pens and cardboard ready to go, you know.
How are you going to vote?
There's been a lot. I keep writing down little short phrases going, oh, geez, could use that one. So, but thank you everybody for coming along. Thank you for your energy and enthusiasm. It's a, you know, it's a pretty tough topic, but I think we have certainly heard from some amazing speakers. Thank you to both panels, so both the practitioners, but particularly to the women with experience of imprisonment who have very bravely and generously shared of your experiences. So thank you so much. And point taken about the diversity of the panel, heard, and we did make efforts, but not enough. So very much appreciate you raising that. I think we've kind of, hopefully, we've all been left with plenty of food for thought tonight. Hopefully we can all agree that we need to stop locking up women of all backgrounds, women of different racial backgrounds, women of different criminal histories, gender diverse and trans women. So I think hopefully that's a pretty clear thing that we've heard tonight. I've got a lot of scribbled notes here, so I'm trying to just, you know...
I just want to say too, if you see someone struggling, pay it forward.
Yeah, totally. Yep.
Don't call the cops ever, ever.
Just defund them.
Yeah. So we've spoken quite a lot about solutions in both of the sessions, which I think has been really great, and they've ranged in you know, from reform right through to abolition. I think there's been a whole variety of ideas that we've heard from, but there's a lot of commonality in them, I think. So you know, it's really clear that the majority of incarcerated women have experienced violence and harm and have a complexity of issues that they face as a result of the trauma they've experienced: poverty, homelessness, health issues, including mental health and alcohol concerns. And I think we definitely need to be thinking much more about how we take a gendered and an intersectional approach to trauma-informed programs that divert women away from prisons and into health and social systems that they need. And I think we've also heard a lot from this panel about the stigma, the impact of having that kind of digital history and surveillance. That means that, you know, that impacts on your ability to access services. And so I think that's really something we need to think about. You know, we clearly need to desperately change the system, and there's ways, certainly through the bail reform. I mean, I think that was a very common, a lot of agreement about bail reform, whether we call it reform or still. But I think definitely see that there's some issues with that, with bail, and that, you know, people shouldn't be put on bail because they're a risk to the they should be a risk to the community, not a risk to themselves, and that's not a reason to put someone on bail. And that seriously, that if people haven't committed serious crimes, they should be just released on bail until their matter's heard. So that's pretty straightforward, I think. Investment in more safe and secure public and social housing, mentioned time and time again, not an easy one, but the clear link between it as a driver of women's imprisonment and re-imprisonment, I think came through very strongly. Building a gendered understanding of the needs of women in the justice system. So this is everyone that women come into contact with: police, prosecutors, judicial officers, service providers, and those working in the prisons. We really need to get them understanding the needs of women in those circumstances. I love the Stop Criminalising Public Health issues, and we've heard quite a bit about, you know, whether it be drug issues, mental health issues, that these are not reasons for someone to be in prison. These are reasons for you to be seeking, for getting good social services. We've heard that the current system fails women and acts as a proxy for a fully functioning social system. I love that too. That was Karen. And about the need for culturally appropriate responses to all of these issues, and for Aboriginal people, particularly a community-led approach to respond and prevent to the extraordinary number of Aboriginal women in our prisons. I could go on. Oh, I loved the community and unity stuff too, Sarah. I think that was a really lovely, positive way to think about things as well, like that kind of finishing on the what a world looks like without prison, reinvesting into our community, I think is a really positive way to think about abolition as well, is that, you know, it's about actually us building unity and community. So thank you all. I think that's probably, that's all I can take from my scribble on the page here. I hope you're leaving feeling energised with a desire to use what you have heard to affect change. And just finally, some really business. There's a QR code up the back on the food tables. If you haven't scanned it and filled out a little survey for us, please do. Otherwise, we'll be chasing you on email anyway to try and get your feedback about today, because we're really keen to know what you thought worked and didn't work about the day. I should have said, yep, sorry. And for those in the community legal sector, we will be reaching out to you to understand more about the work that you're doing with around lived experience and you know, what's going on in your sector, in your centres, how can we strengthen our ability to collaborate and learn from one another. And I will just finish on the idea that really any solutions need to be driven by the very women who are, have experiences of being in prison. So thank you all. Okay.
I've got a big voice anyway, doesn't it? Yeah. Just would like to say, please support Jazz with her Bendigo Street documentary. You can look it up and donate online, and if you also haven't already done so, please sign the open letter for Homes Not Prisons. Yeah.